Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone, to another episode of Democracy Exchange with the Depot. My name's Connor Hand, and I'll be your host today. And today we're joined by Dr. Clayton Rosati, who is an associate professor at BGSU's School of Media and Communication. Thank you very much for being here today. To start off our episode today, we'd like to ask, why are you interested in AI and climate sustainability? What drew you to this topic?
Yeah, so I should say first, and thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited. So what I should say first, my interest is so I'm a geographer who studies media. And so geographers study the relationship between people and the environments that they build. And my interest in media was one that was, like, how do we push beyond just looking at images and talking about media that way, and thinking more about the studios, the infrastructure, and all of that sort of thing, and the labor behind producing these important cultural artifacts. And so, when I was going to work on my dissertation, I was going to study Times Square and its production of TV studios in Times Square, and the labor that was happening in those studios to create these audience interactions and things in the city. And one of my advisors said, look, New York City is big, so why don't you start with something smaller? And since I'm from Virginia, Northern Virginia, I kind of had grown up watching all of these farms become housing tracts and data centers in the 1990s. And so that was something that I had seen happening, and I thought, okay, well, here's another media infrastructure, at this point when the internet was really developing. And so I decided I would look into why these things are locating in Virginia, and how they were bringing them there. And so that was like, over 20 years ago.
Couple of things have changed.
Some things have changed, but some other things haven't, you know. And so I started. So that was sort of the start of something, and since then I've been interested in how how media has a footprint in the real world. So my interest isn't exactly in climate, for instance, or natural resources or whatever, but I am interested in the kind of cultural environments that media create, and I include the climate and resources and geopolitics and all of that in that definition, I guess.
Perfect. Well, I'm super glad to get us started here then. And you mentioned that you had witnessed a lot of these data farms come in when you were younger. And so could you highlight a little bit on some of the differences between those kind of older, I guess, regular data centers and a lot of these new AI data centers that we are seeing? Yeah.
So it's an important distinction, if only just in terms of their scale. So it's really surprised me when, I'd heard about how much bigger the AI data centers are, but they're much bigger than what you used to see, creeping up in Virginia around Dulles Airport and Manassas and the battlefields there and whatever. Yeah. And so they use the AI data centers use a lot more power, like maybe 3 times as much power. And they're not air cooled, they're liquid cooled. And they do a lot more of the inferential work that we kind of take AI to kind of, function for. So if we want AI to invent a picture for us, it uses all of that computing power, which is much more intense than regular data centers that are storing things or running databases and things like that. So that inferential work is costly in terms of energy, and it creates a lot of heat too, which is what requires the cooling.
All right, thank you. And so you mentioned, right, Virginia is one of the top states in the United States that has a lot of these data centers, but also we've noticed recently an uptick in the Midwest, and specifically in Ohio, which leads the region. What kind of conditions are investors looking for when they're thinking about planning where these new data centers are going to be placed?
Yeah, Virginia is, I think, the top I think, still the top in the world of data center capacity.
Wow.
And so it's a massive, concentration of computing capacity there. The other two biggest ones in the U.S. are California and Texas, but Ohio and Indiana and some others are not far off. What initially attracted people to Virginia was tax incentives, lots of good tax incentives, and also a proximity to big network connections. So that led to, and I think also one that isn't talked about a lot is access to government money. I mean, I think like the government consulting and spending economy that was in Northern Virginia at that time made it possible for some of these things to flourish as well. Northrop Grumman is right there, and all sorts of other companies that are spending money on things like telecommunications. So I think in other places that didn't necessarily have those kinds of early benefits or early environmental, benefits, it's proximity to other strategic markets. So, for instance, Arizona is attractive in spite of how crazy it sounds to build data centers that require so much water in Arizona. They are close to California in certain ways. And it's not just that proximity, it's also that there aren't a lot of natural disasters there. So, of course, you don't want a place that's prone to earthquakes or hurricanes or tornadoes, because that might lead to downtime in the service with those kinds of interruptions. So those are some other things. There's also access to water, a favorable tax environment, a favorable policy and regulatory environment, and maybe also not a lot of local resistance. And so that's, we can maybe talk more about that, but I think, farmers who might be struggling to figure out what to do with their land is a situation that would be, it's a situation that would be favorable for people trying to buy land for data centers. So.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, there's a lot of requirements that go in one of these data centers in terms of the water, in terms of the electricity. Mm-hmm. What are some of these local environmental harms that we might see, and are these harms at all outweighed by the economic benefits that data centers bring?
Yeah, the harms are so many. If you talk to, if you ask people, there's a long list of the harms, and some of them, I want to say in advance, are hard to really gauge because there isn't a lot of there aren't a lot of regulatory requirements for disclosure of how much water or what sort of chemicals in the water that's being used and that sort of thing. So there's some murkiness in how much damage that these water demands can how damaging these water demands can be. But there are some things that I think can say pretty clearly, which is that people who live around data centers complain about the noise. They do have a big effect on water demand in those areas. If there's a leak and the data center uses glycol or antifreeze or other chemicals in those systems, even if they're a closed system, if they leak, then that's leaking into the groundwater. Mm-hmm. And then there's the power generation that's usually also happening simultaneously, mostly on site. So if you have a natural gas plant that's operating to produce the energy for that data center or as a backup, then whatever pollution that comes out of that is also going into the air around it. In Virginia, it's really kind of stark to see, the houses that are built right next to data centers, and people have the electrical hum, they have the cooling systems, they have, the generators that are going. So there's a lot of sound and also, smells that are associated with data centers. the question of where the energy comes from is a big one. So in Bowling Green, we've had a long debate, like maybe longer than a decade, about a power plant in, I think it's Illinois, that the city has some entanglement with in terms of investment or something. And so, that power plant is probably going to be producing some of the energy. It's a coal plant, is going to be producing probably some of the energy for this this data center in Wood County. And so, where is this energy coming from? And is a big question. And for I think for the current situation, when there isn't a lot of incentive left to build green energy, what I hear most community groups and activist groups that are concerned about this issue saying is that the easiest thing is fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are going to be powering data centers, at least until nuclear can happen. But they're seeing that as kind of a long ways away.
Right. It takes a long time to develop those nuclear capabilities. Absolutely.
And to build the plant safely and all of that stuff. So for the next 5 years or so, I think people are seeing fossil fuels.
Yeah. And it will definitely be, I mean, it makes sense that the companies would have to fall back on something that they can throw right there and plug it into the grid. I mean, you have, for example, a data center being planned in Michigan that's going to require as much power as the entire city of Detroit by 2027. And it's truly just, I mean, as you said, the energy use is not going to be sustainable in that regard.
So there are other costs too, though. I mean, and I think, there's a concept in economics called externalities. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a concept that describes how the price of a commodity doesn't reflect the kind of burdens or extra kind of costs that communities have to pay because of the pollution or, if they make taxi driving, redundant with Ubers, then, these are costs essentially to a community. And so there are ways of thinking about those aspects as costs. So some people are being displaced from their houses, and, homes that they lived in for 30 years and raised children with or raised children in. And so, how this is a cost. It's not clear how that's going to be reflected in a price that, it's hard to imagine a price being put on that sort of thing.
Right. And we do start to see some local resistance come from those, family farms or houses that have been passed down for generations. You mentioned earlier about the data center that's coming up here in Wood County, and I've spoken to people who live near it, and they're very concerned. I do want to point out that cancellations have been on the rise. At the start of this year, I think we're up to 34 cancellations of these data center projects. So do you see local resistance start to build up, mostly from a geographic standpoint there, where they're concerned about land use?
Well, yes. So there's land use. I mean, I think where it starts is, hey, we don't need the pollution. We don't want the ugly views. This is, bad for farming. All of these sorts of things, I think, are usually where this starts, or at least how I've seen that start in the Midwest. In Virginia, I see that in similar ways, like outside of the Dulles area. So where it's still more rural and like bucolic, and everyone's concerned about what their horse farm is going to sit next to, or whatever. And that's become a big political organizing kind of cry for people. But I'm interested in the kind of complexities of that. So you also have like electricians and building trades people who are like, hey, this is work for us. We need this work. And there's all sorts of responses that are that I think still need to be thought through in complicated ways. Some of the stuff in Virginia, though, is even more complicated. So there are several, for instance, very old African American cemeteries that have been disturbed by data center construction in Virginia. And so I'm working on a project right now with a photographer. His name is Stephen Voss, who's done a lot of photography around these disturbances of historic sites and sites of public memory and ancestry, really. And so how we kind of balance those costs with the jobs, I think is a question that the public needs to be engaged in and find a solution to. I mean, it seems like this is a problem we're always struggling with. So one of the interesting things around this is that the water in this area is already suffering. So I think there needs to be a more engaged conversation around the environmental sides of this issue. And not just here. I mean, the whole country is, and the world really is in a real water crisis. And so, if you look at the BG area in Wood County, there were old oil wells that weren't capped properly 100 years ago that have leaked already into well water and stuff in this area. In Lucky, there's an old military site that has leaked radioactive material into the water there. And we have all of the factory farming and massive agricultural work in this area. That's also, contributing to the algal blooms in in Lake Erie. And so I feel like one of the things that is an important thing that I feel we should be talking about is that if we're concerned about data centers, we should be concerned about all of these things all at the same time. And to me, it seems like we have a kind of incomplete way of dealing with the distribution of the pains of industries that come and go and impact our environment and our way of life.
Right, and that's a big long-term concern about data centers, where what is going to happen to these places if AI doesn't prove to be what a lot of investors are banking that it's going to be. And so to talk about water quality, the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, or OEPA, recently, I don't believe they've decided yet, but they're looking into a permit that would allow data centers to discharge water in the surface level bodies of water in Ohio. And although they promised that water would be, monitored and regulated and they ensure it remain drinkable, it is a big concern because a lot of the items that they're using in these data center cooling plants may contribute, as you mentioned, to more algae blooms. So do we see that there's probably going to be similar issues from the past rearing its head again with these data centers?
I can't imagine that there wouldn't be, right? I mean, how could there not be similar problems if we're not studying things correctly, if we're not applying appropriate protections for the public and for our environments? It seems to me that is something that this kind of deregulation is going to affect. And already, I think we've watched the EPA, and this is before some of this deregulation. We've watched the EPA getting sued in a series of lawsuits over their inability to really prevent other kinds of problems in our environment. And so, you kind of wonder, well, where does that go? If that was prior to some of the more recent deregulation, it seems to me that we are going to have some of these, hopefully some of these struggles, on the legal side from environmental groups and from communities. But you hate to see people have to fight over that with a regulatory body. I think a bigger, I don't know, I'll call it a cost, but I think a bigger problem is the lack of trust that will kind of develop further in our public institutions. Who do we count on to speak up for the public's well-being if it's not the EPA? And traditionally, the EPA hasn't done a very good job in the past. And so if we're talking about deregulating them further, then it kind of gets into scary territory.
And the OEPA had a lot of pushback on limiting their comment section. They had to extend it. It was originally only a month. They had to extend it to, and I believe it's still open now as the time of recording. And they've received about 2,000 or 3,000 additional comments. And so I think with data centers, we might see, again, that continual degradation of trust amongst our institutions, because you have stuff where the OAPA only has comments open for a month or 2 months.
Right.
And then unless someone notices that, you don't have a lot of that local resistance.
Yeah. I think, you're seeing, because people see these things on the landscape, the nature of our media environment actually impacts their like commute, their daily lives, and all of those sorts of things. But I think also, things already look corrupt enough to the American public, I think. And then you have these situations where it looks like our environmental protection agency is like, saying, well, let's go, whatever you want to do, it's fine, we're open for business, basically. And I think that's a problem for public confidence. And it's not just, I think there's a sentiment that thinks out there that looks at things that way, that there were a couple of editorials from the Toledo Blade that I remember reading. They were just like a month or two ago. Well, maybe they were longer, but anyway, there were a couple of editorials from the Toledo Blade that I remember reading, and they said, listen, if you think that you can resist data centers like people in the rich suburbs of Columbus are doing, you should think again, Northwest Ohio, because you can't afford it. And I thought, wow, what a horrible way of thinking about the environment, the quality of people's lives, what that means for health and the environment and all of those sorts of things. And so I think there's already a kind of trust issue, and it seems like we're leaning into it now, and really, I think, extending this kind of crisis that people see of corruption in our society and government especially.
And I think that local resistance gets more difficult when you have such divisive opinions on AI, right? There are people who view AI as a tool and that it's going to really help them, or they're using it on a near daily basis. Yeah. And then you also have people who never use AI, or for one reason or another have decided they never will. And I think that's a great segment into like university policy, because we've seen a very big, even in my 3 years, we've seen a very big shift of absolutely no AI to AI might be acceptable under these circumstances, or if it was properly disclosed. So where do you really see university sentiment with AI going? Is it going to be more of a tool for them, or is it going to be something where we see kind of a revival of reading a lot and going back to before AI, or maybe even further back before computers were helping us in that sense?
It's a great question, because it's impossible to answer. Like I'm not sure. There's so much diversity in the responses that I think it's hard to sort of say, well, here's what the direction is going to be. And that's been one of the, I think, nice things about BG, is that it hasn't said you have to allow people to use it or you have to ban it or whatever. They've been very flexible at leaving it up to the faculty members to determine how AI is going to sort of function in their curriculum. I banned it, whatever that means. I disallow that. I think it's in the kind of classes where you have to do reading and writing. It doesn't make sense that would be an honest way of working, basically. And I also don't like tech in general in my classes. I find that it doesn't really contribute to good discussions, and I think we need good discussions in the world today. So if we're not practicing that, then we're practicing something else, and I'm nervous about what that other thing would be.
Well, the entire staff at Depot is well in agreement with you. That's our core mission here is to try to embrace a lot of those discussions, and not even just here on the podcast or in classes, but just out in the community as well. And so to kind of wrap up our episode today, I do want to ask, what can students do to stay informed on these topics? With AI and sustainability and the issues that we see even locally here.
So I'm going to backtrack before I answer that question, because one of the things that you asked me earlier was, how do the environmental costs measure against the economic benefits?
Yeah.
And there have been a number of studies that, especially in Virginia, which has a lot of experience with this, that show that there really aren't a whole lot of economic benefits as far as job creation for with data centers. And so a statistic that I found from the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission in Virginia, which was studying data centers, is that data centers essentially are 0.01% of jobs in the country, but use 4.4% of the electricity. And so that's maybe one way of thinking about, the kind of disproportionality of the economic benefits to the costs in some sense. In Virginia, the economy is a booming economy, but a lot of that is because of government spending and government contracts. And so it's the biggest the biggest receiver of government contracts in the country also. So it's hard to say that it's hard to look at that case and say, well, Virginia is thriving because of data centers. I think there's a coincidence there, but I don't think that that one causes the other, or the data centers cause that. So I think there's a lot of things to think about in this area when it comes to that. I mean, the tax money that you get is attractive, but it's also a big question. What happens when those tax abatements kick in? I mean, how much tax revenue is a locality or a state actually getting, since they've said, well, look, you can build here with zero tax or whatever the percentage is. And then you add into that, the kinds of cost deferrals, like removing the environmental, some of the environmental regulations and things. So I think these are things that we have to think about. And to some extent, I guess this gets to your next question. What can we do? How do we get involved? I think education is a really important part of this, in the sense that I think we often look at education as something, or we often talk about education as something that is really about getting you a job. And I think when we look at some of these very serious issues with water quality, with the preservation of our ancestral, burial grounds, with all sorts of things that have to do with our quality of lives, education is about knowing when we're confronting an issue that is going to make our lives worse. And we should be able to, I think, have community education that empowers us to be able to say, no, this is a bad idea. And to do that, we need to not just be thinking about how much money we're going to make after we graduate. We also need to be thinking about, what am I learning that's going to be useful for my community? Because, you don't always benefit from economic development, or certain kinds of economic development. And communities need to be able to tell the difference. And so I think that's one thing, right? Like, start learning about these things, but also start advocating for education that isn't just about how much money you make when you graduate. And that will then, I think, have a domino effect where we have to start thinking about it. Well, how do we make money also, especially in a world that's increasingly inhabited by automated, computer functions. So, artists are having to worry about this. How do we maintain a human arts a
human elements of the arts?
Yeah, in our society, we already spend way less than other wealthy countries on cultivating arts, and so that's a crisis we've been dealing with for years. So how do we keep moving forward with that? I think there's a lot of and these vary from place to place, but there are a lot of organizations that you can get involved with to, if you're worried specifically about data centers or about, the relationship between data centers and the environment. Like, for instance, Food and Water Watch is a national organization that's been very active in Virginia and New York and also Michigan and Pennsylvania. And they've recently, like in December, called for a national moratorium on data centers and on data center construction or new data center construction, so that we can, say, hold on, let's just figure this stuff out. And I think that's an angle that maybe students or community members or all of us can start thinking about and look into getting involved with if there's an organization around us that would do that. In Virginia, the Sierra Club is very involved in that sort of thing too, in environmental protection as it relates to data centers. But these can be kind of individual, depends on who's in the Sierra Club in this place or that place,
Right, and it depends on the person, what they're interested in, and the dimension that they want to push back, or even to stay informed on data centers, right? Because you have environment, you have economics, you have all these different factors.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I want to try to see all those things together. So as a geographer, I want to see like, okay, we have there's a famous kind of teaching tool in geography where you're in a big lecture intro class and you say, okay, everybody look at the tag on the person's t-shirt next to you. Where did it come from? And that way everyone can sort of think about how their lives are connected to all of these processes that are happening all across the world, really. And how, the thing that's advertising your university or is, displaying your favorite, I don't know, candy or something, also has connections to labor in Haiti or fabric production in Thailand or whatever. And so for me, I want us to think about AI in this really broad way, because what we're looking at are a really planetary set of changes that we're engaging with, and that we have been engaging with for about 100 years or so, and we need to think carefully about them and know what we're getting ourselves into, I think.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your insight and your time spent here with us today. It's been a phenomenal discussion talking about AI and sustainability and the environment, and how geography has such a big factor to play and where these data centers are placed.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
And thank you very much to our Depot social media and production team, Julia Amlin, Bryn Drabeck, and Bryce Torres. We're extremely appreciative to have you help us out. Also, a big thanks to Falcon Radio and our advisor, Dr. Robert Alexander. This has been our episode with Dr. Rosati on AI and sustainability, and we hope to see you all next time. Thank you very much.